Well, Turkey's president has strongly criticized efforts by several Gulf countries and Egypt, who he claims are trying to isolate Qatar over allegations that the country is a state sponsor of terror. He described the move by 4 Arab countries as, quote, a death penalty for the small but wealthy oil-rich country. Now, in a speech to party members in Ankara, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan reiterated his country's support of Qatar and pledged to help end the crisis. He said that Qatar has practically been sentenced to death, adding that it is neither humane nor Islamic to isolate a neighboring country. Turkey's foreign minister paid a visit to Doha, Qatar's capital, this week, and Erdogan called on the king of Saudi Arabia to resolve the crisis. So, what's behind this family feud, and what's the U.S. involvement in all of this? To help us out with that, we are joined once again by VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb and by our White House bureau chief, Steve Herman. I thank you both for sticking around for a second segment here. Now, to both of you, before we get started, because I get a lot of questions on this, let's clear this up. What is the correct pronunciation of Qatar?
Qatar.
Is it Qatar or?
I would go with Qatar.
So if you go with Qatar.
Right. I lived there for a couple of weeks, and when I was in Doha, the locals would say Qatar. But it is an American English pronunciation to say Qatar. So technically, either pronunciation
So what
is
do you
correct.
call the people who live in Qatar?
Qatari.
Qatari. Is that how we pronounce it? Qatari. Okay.
That's close enough. It's hard to get Arabic into English.
Steve, okay, so let's drill down into this issue. What are you making of this Arab split, and why are these 4 countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt, ganging up all of a sudden on Qatar?
Well, this is the Middle East, and nothing's black and white. And there's an old phrase that my enemy's enemy is my friend. There are lots of frenemies, enemies, friends in that area. But I think one objective assessment would be that Qatar has been perceived as punching way above its weight for many years, for many reasons, trying to play all sides, and that has caused resentment. There's a lot more to it, but that's a very simple explanation.
But that answers a lot, though. But Carla, we do know that one of the complaints is that Qatar is close to Iran. It's very supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood and, of course, Hamas. But what are the facts, actually, regarding its terrorist inclinations when it comes to groups like Al-Qaeda or Islamic State?
Well, you mentioned all the connections that we know. So when it comes to the Islamic State, Qatar has actually not really had any sort of support for Islamic State that we know of. In fact, Doha has actually sent some of its force out on patrols over Syria in support of this counter-Islamic State coalition. So no ties there. When it comes to Al-Qaeda, however, it's a little more muddy because of their association with the Taliban. And Qatar has an area which is considered a political office for the Taliban there. They're using this, they say, to start conversations between the Taliban and the United States and the Afghan government. But there is that support there that Secretary Mattis calls gray funding. And it's not black, it's not white, it's not directly giving support to Al-Qaeda, but it ends up in this nebulous area where the funding can get to that terror group. But it's interesting to point that out because they're not the only ones doing that. In fact, there are members of Congress right here in the United States that say Saudi Arabia did that and helped inadvertently fund the attacks on September 11th, 2001.
So how does Saudi Arabia respond to those?
Well, you have to understand that Qatar is basically caught in the middle of this intense rivalry in the Islamic world between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the Saudis want everybody playing by their rules. And then you have also the factor of Al Jazeera, this voice that is funded and broadcast from Qatar to the entire region. And other countries have blamed Al Jazeera for being biased and inflaming the situation all the way
Does the
into Northern
U.S.
Africa.
president bear some responsibility for fomenting this crisis, though, for Qatar?
Well, I would say that most people have said that his tweets were not helpful. We have U.S. military facilities in Qatar, as well as in Bahrain, which is on the other side of this. And there was some criticism that maybe the president didn't realize this, but when in his speech in Riyadh, where I was in the room for that, he specifically did mention CENTCOM being.
And I wanted to talk
Qatar.
to Carl about that because that sort of puts us, the United States, as kind of a weird conundrum. Qatar
very tricky
is home
position.
to the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East, some 10,000
Yes.
American troops there. How can we condemn Qatar and still continue to operate there?
Well, it's not affecting operations. The Pentagon has repeatedly said, although there was one little hiccup this week when Secretary Tillerson said that it was affecting operations. The Pentagon scrambled and came out with a statement about an hour later saying that while it wasn't affecting current operations, it was getting in the way of some future planning. So that's kind of how they smoothed that over
There seem to
there.
be suggestions that from some countries that perhaps the United States should move its military base out of Qatar.
Well, obviously, those who are allied with Riyadh and the Saudis themselves would prefer to see that happen. But you've got a situation now in Qatar where Maersk, the world's biggest shipper, is saying nothing's going to go in or out of Qatar through our ships. It's just not logistically feasible. And so it's not affecting operations right now. But when you're talking about movement of personnel, the country being isolated, and you have Turkey and Iran now coming to its aid, this situation is not tenable. I believe it is a much more dangerous situation. It's very volatile, and there has to be moves to tamper this down, or it could get out of control.
Carla, I assume this is going to further complicate U.S. response in the region.
Well, yes, because you mentioned that it was the largest base in the region, but it's also the headquarters for U.S. Central Command, the forward headquarters there. So there's operations against the Islamic State. There's also the operations in Afghanistan that we were just talking about earlier in the show. So all of those could potentially be affected. Is it going to happen? My sources say no. There are too many reasons why the United States wants to keep that base right where it is. There are too many reasons why Qataris want the United States there, but there are contingency
as always,
plans.
it's a fascinating discussion and never enough time to actually explore all the issues. But my thanks to Steve Herman and Carla Babb for double duty, and to all our correspondents today. That is our show. We hope you join us again next week for another edition of The Correspondents. And make sure to visit us at voanews.com to find out what's going on all over the world. And do check out our programs there. Just click on the Watch tab on the upper right. We're also on Facebook and YouTube at VOA The Correspondents. Thanks for watching. I'm Mil Arcega for now. So long from Washington.